My mother-in-law taped a 5-day eviction notice to my own front door and signed it, the property manager. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon in April, stuck right at eye level above the deadbolt, positioned so I couldn't possibly miss it before I got my key out. Above my name, in her handwriting, she'd written a single word. Squatter. She had no idea that house was mine, free and clear, deed recorded in one name and one name only. She had no idea what I do for a living, 5 days a week, in an office 3 miles from that door. And she had absolutely no idea that 3 weeks earlier, on a slow Tuesday between 2 closings, I'd already had every lock on that house rekeyed. By the time she found out, her whole plan had already collapsed. She just hadn't been told yet. This is the story of how my husband's mother tried to move her entire household into my house while I was 400 miles away at a title industry conference, and how a key that wouldn't turn ended up teaching her more about property law than I ever wanted to have to teach anyone. If you're new here, welcome. I tell stories about ordinary people who win family battles quietly with paperwork and patience instead of shouting matches. This one has a forged signature, a locksmith who got lied to, and a woman who found out the hard way that a deed isn't a feeling. Stay through to the end, because the calmest part of the story is also the part that changes everything. And if that sounds like your kind of story, go ahead and subscribe now, because you won't want to stop halfway through this one. Let me back up about 4 years, to before the notice, before the moving truck idled in my driveway, before I even knew my mother-in-law could trace a signature off a birthday card held up to a window. My name is Meredith Hale. I'm 34, and I close real estate transactions for a living, title and escrow, mostly residential, a little commercial. I read deeds the way most people read street signs, fast and automatic, until something's off. Then I slow down and read every line 3 times. It's a strange thing to build a career around, catching the small print other people skim past, but it's the exact skill that ended up saving my house, so I'm not complaining about it anymore. I'd caught fraud before, just never anything personal. 2 years earlier, I flagged a straw buyer scheme on a duplex in the next county over, a seller using a cousin's identity to dodge a lien, and I remember feeling almost proud walking that file over to my manager like I'd done something clever instead of just something careful. I never once imagined the next forged signature I'd catch would belong to my own mother-in-law. I kept my last name when I married Derek Calloway 6 years ago. It wasn't a statement. In my line of work, a name on a deed matters more than a name on an invitation, and my house was already titled to me before Derek and I ever set a wedding date. Hold on to that detail. It matters later. The house sits on Birchwood Lane, a narrow street with maple trees old enough to arch clean over the road by July. It belonged to my grandmother, Joan Hale, a woman who canned her own tomatoes every August whether anyone asked her to or not, and who used to sit me down at her kitchen table when I was maybe 11 and show me her deed, actually show me the paper and tell me, "This is what makes it yours, sweetheart. Not the key, not the furniture. This piece of paper right here." I didn't understand it then. I understood it completely, 23 years later, standing on that same porch reading a stranger's handwriting calling me a squatter. Grandma Joan left me that house paid off in full when she passed 6 years ago, right around the time Derek and I got engaged. No mortgage, no lien, my name on the deed, filed and recorded myself because I wanted to watch it done correctly. Derek moved in the year we married. He loved that house nearly as much as I did. Some evenings he'd sit on the back porch and say his mother would love this yard, and I'd smile and mean it, because back then, I genuinely liked his mother. Sandra Calloway, 61 at the time, a retired elementary school secretary, the kind of woman who remembers every birthday on the calendar and shows up with a casserole before you've even told anyone you're sick. For the first 2 years of the marriage, she was warm toward me in a way that felt completely real, and I want to be fair about that, because it makes what came later harder to explain and harder to excuse. She was also the kind of mother-in-law who complimented your cooking and then told you how her own mother made it better, all in the same breath, delivered warmly enough that you found yourself thanking her for the correction. I noticed that pattern early and mostly let it go, because plenty of mothers-in-law do that, and it never seemed worth a fight over pot roast. It didn't change all at once. It changed slowly enough that I never clocked it as a pattern until it already was one, which I think is exactly how these things are designed to work. It started with a key. Spring after the wedding, Sandra asked for one, just in case, in case of emergencies, phrased the way you don't argue with. I cut her a copy myself at the hardware store on Route 9. Reasonable enough, or so I thought at the time. 18 months later, I came home on a Wednesday to find my kitchen curtains gone, swapped for a valance from a HomeGoods clearance rack because, in Sandra's words, the old ones were dated. She'd let herself in while Derek and I were both at work to redecorate my kitchen without asking either of us. I didn't make it a fight. I thanked her lightly and quietly put Grandma Jones' curtains back up the following weekend. Derek never saw the exchange. He rarely saw any of them, which I understand now was very much by design. Sandra was careful about what she let her son witness. Then came the deed comments, small at first. At a 4th of July cookout 2 years in, she mentioned, almost offhand, that it seemed strange for a married man's name not to be on his own house. I explained our reasoning, an attorney's advice to wait until year 5 for estate and tax purposes, standard stuff. She nodded like she understood. She brought it up again at Thanksgiving that same year. Again at Derek's birthday in February. Again the following Easter. For separate holidays, for versions of the same nudge, always wrapped in something that sounded like concern, never quite phrased as a request, so there was never anything clean enough to actually push back against. Around that same stretch, my neighbor, Rosa Alvarez, mentioned one afternoon over the fence that she'd seen Derek's mom out front one morning with a little notebook, measuring the porch and jotting something down. I laughed it off at the time. Probably thinking about a wreath for the door, I said. Rosa laughed too. Neither of us thought anything else about it for almost 2 years, but I've thought about it plenty since. Around that same stretch, my cousin sent me a screenshot from Sandra's Facebook, a photo from a church potluck with a caption that read, "Can't wait to have everyone together at the house for good. No address tagged, no names attached, nothing you could hold up as proof of anything. Just a sentence sitting out in public, where I wasn't around to see it happen in real time, the kind of thing that only means something once you already know what to look for." Then came Walter's fall. My father-in-law, 66, went off a stepladder cleaning gutters one October and cracked 2 ribs. Nothing life-threatening, but enough for a hospital stay and a scare that rattled the whole family. Sandra called in tears, and of course we said come stay with us while he recovers. We have a guest room. Take whatever time you need. What we meant was 2 weeks. What happened was closer to 2 months, and every time I gently asked about their own house, sitting completely empty 4 miles away, Sandra would say something like, "We just don't want to rush it," while Walter watched football every evening in Grandma Jones' recliner like he'd lived there his whole life. They eventually went home, but something had shifted in Sandra during those 2 months. She'd gotten a taste of what it felt like to actually live in that house, and I don't think she ever fully let go of the feeling. By year 4 of the marriage, Derek and I sat down with our attorney, a longtime family friend named Grant Okafor, to update our estate plan now that we were starting to think about having kids. Grant's advice was simple and sensible. Add Derek to the deed properly, through a new warranty deed, both our signatures notarized in person, filed correctly, so the house would pass to him outright without any probate mess if anything ever happened to me. I agreed immediately. It made complete sense. We scheduled the signing for the following month. Somehow, Sandra found out about the plan before that appointment ever happened. I still don't know exactly how. Maybe Derek mentioned it to Tiffany, and it traveled from there. But by the time I noticed, Sandra had already started talking about the house differently. Not your house anymore. Not even yours and Derek's. Just the house. The flat, possessive way you'd refer to something that already belonged to everyone in the family equally. At Tiffany's wedding that spring, I overheard Sandra telling a table of her church friends that Birchwood Lane was where we'll all gather once we're settled and properly. I remember standing there holding a glass of Prosecco, smiling at a stranger, filing that sentence away the same way I file an unusual clause in a contract. Not panicking, just noting it. Then on a Sunday in March, I got a call from a woman named Priya Nair. Priya and I have worked opposite sides of the same transactions for 6 years, me evaluating title, her processing filings at the county recorder's office. So we know each other's world well enough to trust a phone call that starts with, "Hey, quick question, does this look right to you?" I could hear her office in the background, a printer running, someone's radio turned low to a classic rock station, the same sounds I'd heard 100 times, standing in that recorder's office myself, waiting on a stamped copy. She read me a file number. A quitclaim deed that had crossed her desk 2 days earlier. Property address, 114, Birchwood Lane. My address. Adding 2 new grantees to the title. Sandra and Walter Calloway. I told her that deed shouldn't exist. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't stood in front of a notary in months. Priya went quiet for a second on the other end of the line, and then said the sentence that changed the rest of my year. Because the signature on this one doesn't match the signature card we've got on file from your last 3 closings. Not even close, Mayor. I didn't call Derek first. I know how that sounds, but in my job, when you find a fraudulent filing, you don't react, you document, and I wanted the ground solid under me before I said a word to anyone in that family. I asked Priya to flag the recording under review and send me a certified copy. Then I called Grant. Grant's office sits above a dry cleaner downtown, the kind of place with a coffee maker older than his paralegal and his own grandfather's law degree framed crooked on the wall. He read the deed twice, set it down, and looked at me over his glasses the way he does right before he tells a client something they don't want to hear. I've seen forged deeds before, he said. I've never seen one where the victim also happened to know exactly how to catch it. I told him that wasn't luck. That was just Tuesday for me. Grant looked at it for less than 5 minutes before he said the word forgery out loud, plainly, the way you'd read a weather report. The notary listed on the deed was a man named Curtis Voss, someone I'd never met, whose commission was registered 2 counties over. Grant called the Secretary of State's Notary Division that same afternoon. Within a week, we learned Curtis Voss was Sandra's second cousin, a man who did occasional notary work out of the back office of a strip mall insurance agency, and who, according to the complaint Grant eventually filed, admitted he'd notarized the deed off a photograph of my driver's license that Sandra had texted him. Not an in-person appearance, which isn't legal notarization in any state I've ever worked in. Derek's signature on that deed was real. Mine wasn't. Sandra had traced it off an old birthday card I'd left sitting on the kitchen counter, holding the page up to a sunlit window like a stencil, the way you trace a leaf in grade school. Grant found the same shaky, hesitant curve under a magnifying glass that Priya had already caught with her bare eyes in about 4 seconds flat. I sat with all of that for 2 full days before I told Derek anything. 2 days of showing up to closings, shaking hands, initialing pages, smiling at strangers signing the biggest purchase of their lives, and coming home every evening to a husband who had no idea his own mother had forged his wife's signature to add herself to a house she had no legal claim to. While I was still deciding how to tell him, I found the second piece of the puzzle completely by accident. Derek and I still had an old shared family calendar app from years back, one Sandra had originally set up for holiday planning and never fully left. Buried in it, under an entry neither of us had created, titled Moving Weekend, were the details laid out plain as day. April 18th. Movers booked for 9 a.m., a company called Bulldog Movers. And underneath that, a note in Sandra's exact phrasing. Backup locksmith booked for 11. If the key doesn't work, tell him it's a lockout, not a rekey, easier that way. She had already planned to lie to a licensed locksmith to get into a house that legally was not hers. She simply had no idea I could still see that calendar. If you've never had someone try to quietly rewrite what belongs to you on paper you never signed, I hope you never do. But if you're still here with me, stay a little longer, because this is exactly where I stopped reacting and started preparing. Hit subscribe if you want to see precisely what that looked like, because what happens next is the part people ask me about the most. I told Derek everything on a Thursday night at our kitchen table, the calendar screenshot, and the forged deed laid out side by side under the overhead light. I watched him read the notary complaint twice. Something in his face folded in on itself. Not disbelief exactly. Worse than that. Recognition. She asked me to sign something in the hospital waiting room, he said quietly. The day Dad fell. She told me it was for his insurance paperwork. I didn't even read it. I just signed where she pointed. That's how Sandra got his real signature onto a document that, paired with a forged one, could have quietly changed who owned my grandmother's house without either of us fully realizing it had happened. He hadn't lied to me. He'd been used, through a different door than the one she tried to use on me. We didn't confront her that week. I know some of you want us to have marched straight over there. But confronting Sandra before everything was locked down would have just handed her time to cover her tracks, and I'd spent enough years in this job to know that paperwork beats emotion, every single time you let it finish first. So instead, we got quiet and we got organized. Grant filed a formal affidavit of forgery with the county recorder, which put a permanent hold on the fraudulent deed and blocked it from ever completing the recording process. He filed the notary complaint against Curtis Voss, who lost his commission within the month. I pulled a certified copy of Grandma Jones' original deed and the full, clean chain of title, just in case anyone ever needed proof of what had been true the entire time. I called my friend Jess, who works closings at a competing title company across town and has known me since we were both 22 and terrified of our first walkthrough. Jess listened to the whole thing over coffee and said exactly one sentence. "Change the locks before you do anything else, Mare. Everything else can wait a week." That can't. She was right, and I already knew it, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel less dramatic and more like simple common sense. On a slow Tuesday between two closings, I called a locksmith. Not the one Sandra had booked for the 18th. Mine, 3 weeks early, a company Grant's office had used for years. I had every lock on the house rekeyed, including the garage side door Sandra had a copy for, and the mudroom door she didn't know I knew she'd also had copied at some point. A fact Rosa Alvarez confirmed for me later, almost apologetically, after everything came out. I had a small security camera installed above the front porch, angled at the door, motion activated, footage saved automatically to my phone. I told Derek exactly what I was doing, step by step, and for once, he didn't ask me to go easier on his mother. He just said, "Do it. All of it." Which brings us back to April 18th, the date already sitting quietly in a calendar I wasn't supposed to see. I had a title industry conference booked in Charlotte that week, 3 days of continuing education credits I genuinely couldn't skip. I'd mentioned the trip to Sandra weeks earlier, the way you casually mention a normal thing in normal conversation, never imagining she was quietly writing the dates down for an entirely different purpose. I flew out Tuesday morning as planned. I flew back Thursday night, 1 full day early, on a ticket I booked the moment I first saw that calendar entry, and I told no one I was coming home ahead of schedule. Not even Derek, who was staying out at his parents' house that week, supposedly to keep his dad company after a follow-up doctor's appointment, which I now understood was really about keeping him conveniently away from Birchwood Lane on the one morning it would have mattered most. My Uber turned onto Birchwood Lane at 9:40 that morning, cool for April, the maples just starting to leaf out over the road, and I already knew before I even saw the truck. I knew from the way 3 cars I recognized were parked wrong, angled hard into the curb the way people park when they're in a hurry. Sandra's sedan, Walter's truck, and behind them, a rented box truck with bulldog movers stenciled across the side, back door already rolled up, ramp already down on the pavement. A few doors down, Rosa Alvarez stood on her own porch in a robe, coffee mug in hand, watching the whole thing unfold with the unhurried attention of someone who'd already half-guessed this morning was coming. She caught my eye once and gave me a small, steady nod, the kind you give someone right before they walk into something hard, letting them know you're not going anywhere. 2 men in matching polo shirts were carrying a dresser I recognized, my grandmother's dresser, up my own front walkway. Sandra stood on my porch in a cardigan, directing them the way you direct traffic, pointing toward the front door with the particular confidence of a woman who still believed the key in her purse worked. It didn't. I stood at the end of the driveway for maybe 10 seconds before I walked up, long enough to hear one of the movers jiggle the doorknob a second time and say, "Ma'am, this key's not turning." Long enough to hear Sandra answer without missing a beat. "Try the other one. There's 2 on the ring. Sometimes they get switched." There wasn't another one. There was only the one I'd cut her 4 years earlier at the hardware store on Route 9, and it hadn't opened that door in 3 weeks. "Sandra," I said. She turned fast enough that her cardigan sleeve caught on the porch railing. For 1 second, just one, I saw something cross her face that wasn't confidence at all. Then it smoothed back over, the way it always did, and she smiled at me like I'd walked in on a surprise party instead of a moving crew. "Meredith, you're early. We wanted to have everything mostly settled before you got back. Make the whole transition easier on everyone." "Transition to what, exactly?" She glanced at Walter, who suddenly found the dresser's drawer pulls extremely interesting. "Well, we talked about this. Derek and I talked about this months ago. With your schedule, and us getting older, it just makes more sense for the family to be under one roof. This house has plenty of room for everyone. This is my house, Sandra. It's the family's house, sweetheart. It has been since Joan passed. She'd have wanted family living in it, not sitting here half empty while you're off at conferences 3 states away. I let that hang in the air a second before answering, because I've learned silence does more work than volume ever will. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd carried since Tuesday morning, the one with a certified copy of Grandma Joan's deed, Grant's signed affidavit of forgery, and the notary board's letter confirming Curtis Voss's commission had been suspended pending investigation. I know about the quitclaim deed, I said. I know Curtis Voss notarized it off a photo you texted him, which isn't legal in any state. I know you traced my signature off an old birthday card. And I know you booked a locksmith for 11 o'clock today and told him to say it was a lockout instead of a rekey, so he wouldn't ask any questions. The porch went completely still. One of the movers, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, quietly set the drawer he was carrying down on the ramp and took 2 steps back toward the truck, the universal instinct of someone who can feel a job about to get complicated. I have no idea what you're talking about, Sandra said, but the conductor's confidence had already drained out of her voice. It had gone thin, almost brittle. It never recorded, I said. It's flagged as fraudulent with the county as of this week. Curtis lost his notary commission, and the locks were changed 3 weeks ago, which you would have found out at 11 o'clock, except I came home a day early. Walter finally spoke, quiet, almost apologetic. Sandra, I told you this felt too rushed. You didn't say a single word of the sort, she snapped, and for the first time all morning, I watched the 2 of them turn on each other instead of on me, which told me more about how much of his plan Walter had actually been comfortable with, versus simply too tired to argue against, than anything either of them could have said directly to me. Sandra tried one more angle, her voice softening into something closer to pleading. What about grandchildren, Meredith? Don't you want them growing up around family, in a real house, all of us together? They will, I said. Just not by you moving into a house I own without ever once asking me first. She didn't have an answer for that one. It was the first time all morning she'd gone completely silent. The lead mover cleared his throat. Ma'am, we're gonna need someone to confirm this address is good before we bring anything else off the truck. It's not good, I said. This is my legal residence. Sole owner, deed on file with the county. I have a certified copy right here if your office needs it for your paperwork. I handed him the top page of the folder. He looked at it, looked at Sandra, looked at the dresser sitting halfway up my walkway, and made the only reasonable call available to him. We're gonna go ahead and reload that, he said to his partner, already reaching for the dolly straps. The locksmith showed up 11 minutes later, right on schedule, a guy in his 50s who took one look at the moving truck backing out of the driveway and the woman frozen on the porch, and said mostly to himself, I'm guessing this isn't a lockout. It's not, I told him. I'm the homeowner. The locks are current. I'm sorry you drove out for nothing. I paid him $40 out of my own pocket for his time, because none of it was his fault, and he left without another word, which is more than I can say for the rest of that morning. Derek pulled into the driveway 9 minutes after that, having driven straight over the second I called him from the porch. He got out of the car, looked at his mother standing there in the wreckage of her own plan, looked at the folder still in my hand, and didn't say a single word to her. He walked straight past her, up the steps, right to me, and said, Are you okay? That's the whole story, honestly, if you only want the short version. Not the deed, not the locks, just a man choosing, in real time, in front of his mother, which side of a porch he was standing on. Sandra cried on that porch, the way people cry when they've been caught rather than when they're truly sorry, and I want to be honest, even knowing the difference, it was hard to watch. Walter apologized quietly, twice, once right there on the porch, and once by phone about a week later, and I believe he meant it, even if he'd never once had the spine to stop things while they were actually happening. Nothing criminal ever came of the forged deed. Grant explained that family fraud cases like this rarely go anywhere near a courtroom unless the victim specifically pushes for it, and I made the decision not to. The affidavit stayed on permanent file. The forged deed stayed void, a dead document that will sit in that county's records forever as exactly what it was. Curtis Voss stayed unemployed as a notary, which felt like an appropriately sized consequence for a man willing to stamp a signature over a text message photo for his cousin. Sandra and Walter's own house, the one they'd quietly listed with a realtor 2 weeks before the move, apparently assuming Birchwood Lane would be theirs by closing, came off the market within the month. As far as I know, they're still there, 4 miles away, in the house they always actually owned and never once tried to give away. Tiffany, Derek's sister, called me about 3 weeks later, not exactly to apologize, more to say she'd had no idea how far it had actually gone, and that she told her mother, quote, "That's not how this is supposed to work," the moment she found out. I believed her. She's the one person on that side of the family I still talk to regularly, and the birthday text she sent me that June was the first message from that family in over a year that didn't arrive with a request attached to it. That following August, I canned tomatoes for the first time, using Grandma Jones' recipe card, spattered and soft at the corners from 40 years of use. Derek stood at the stove stirring while I sterilized jars, and I thought about her sitting me down at that same kitchen table as a kid, sliding her deed across to show me what actually made a house belong to someone. I don't know if she ever imagined I'd need that lesson quite this literally. I like to think she'd have approved of how quiet the whole thing stayed. Derek and I eventually went back to Grant's office and finished the estate planning we'd started before any of this happened. His name is on that deed now, properly, notarized in person, filed correctly, exactly the way it should have been done from the very beginning. Not because his mother pushed for it, because we chose it, on our own timeline, the way ownership is supposed to work between two people who actually trust each other. I still think about that 5-day notice sometimes, the word squatter written above my own name on my own front door. I think about how certain some people can be that what belongs to you is actually theirs, simply because they've said it out loud enough times, in front of enough witnesses, at enough holiday dinners. Sandra never once asked me directly if she and Walter could move in permanently. She never had to. She built an entire version of reality slowly, in offhand comments at Thanksgiving, in a key made just in case, in a calendar app one wasn't supposed to still have access to, trusting that by the time I noticed, it would already be too late to undo any of it. I don't think Sandra is a monster. I think she's a woman who spent 30 years measuring love in casseroles and favors and assumed a house could quietly be added to that same ledger, as long as she kept the conversation warm enough for long enough. That doesn't make it less serious. It just makes it sadder than it needed to be. It wasn't too late. It just required me to stay quieter than she was, for longer than she expected, and to trust the paperwork over the performance, every single time. That's my story. One forged signature, one calendar entry I was never meant to see, and a lock that simply refused to turn on the one morning it mattered most. If this reminded you of your own family, or if you've ever had to protect something that was legally, undeniably yours from people who felt entitled to it anyway, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one. And before you go, here's the question I keep coming back to. If someone spends years quietly talking their way into what's yours instead of ever just asking for it honestly, what does that tell you about the answer they already expected to hear? Where's your line, and would you have drawn it as early as I should have? If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.